Welcome to episode 7 of the Bishop on a Bike podcast. I'm Jim Hazelwood. I'm your host for this. And in this episode, we have something slightly different. Actually, very different. It's not an interview. What you're going to hear is an unedited version of Faith on Tap. This was a conversation that I had last week at the Student Prince in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, if you don't know what the Student Prince is, it is a bar, and it is a conversation between Bishop Mitchell Rozanski of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Springfield, Massachusetts, and myself. This is the last of about 5 events that we have held in the Lutheran Church in New England that commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. We've got about 80 to 100 people around us. It's a Q&A session. It's hosted by Nathaniel Anderson, organized by Lauren Holm. I want to thank them for putting this together. And I thought this would be a nice addition. We'll be back in episode 8 with a return to interviews and conversations with people more specifically and directly about their ministry. But I think you'll enjoy this conversation that's recorded live at the Student Prince.
Welcome, everyone. Great to see such a great turnout tonight. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much to the Student Prince for hosting and providing the food. Food's pretty good here, right?
Yeah, very good.
Absolutely. Grace, one of the managers, has been super helpful with us, and it's just kind of fun that 2 bishops walk into a bar and find Grace. So thank you, Grace.
I think you had the line of the night. We can go home now.
Very good. So you, very unfortunately, I gave you a quiz when you showed up tonight. How did we do? Yeah, pretty good. We're just going to go over it briefly, but before we do, if you have a drink and you want to raise a glass, have a little toast. Martin Luther said it's better to think of church in the alehouse than the alehouse in church. So, Prost.
Prost. Very good.
All right. Well, it is an honor to welcome these 2 bishops with us tonight. Bishop Mitch Rozanski from the Diocese of Springfield. And Bishop Jim Hazelwood of the Lutheran New England Synod. So we thought we'd get started tonight just by hearing a little bit about the bishops, sort of their hobbies, where you're from, Red Sox or Yankees. I hope we're all Patriots fans going in to the Super Bowl. But just a little bit about yourself. Bishop Rozanski, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm a native of Baltimore, Maryland. I was born there almost 60 years ago. Grew up an Orioles fan, and I'm still an Orioles fan. I stuck with them through thick and thin, so I got to stick with them now. I was a Colts fan when the Colts were part of Baltimore. We've never forgiven Indianapolis, even though we're supposed to forgive those who trespass against us. But that was a big hurt for the city of Baltimore to lose the Colts. I've never really taken too much to the Ravens, so I can be a New England fan now that I'm here in Massachusetts. So that's a happy thought. We'll cheer them on Sunday. I really expected to be a parish priest all of my life. When I was ordained, I was sent into different parishes, and in my last parish assignment, I was very happy. It was a place where we had a great staff, we had a great parish, a good community, a lot of outreach in ecumenical and interfaith relations. And then I got a phone call that kind of changed everything. My bishop at the time, Cardinal Keeler, called me and wanted to see me. I thought I was being called to the principal's office. I thought something had gone wrong. And then he told me that I was named auxiliary bishop of Baltimore. And he reminded me after he asked me the question that one does not say no to the Holy Father. So I accepted graciously. And then 4 years ago, got a call from the nuncio telling me that I was appointed the Bishop of Springfield, Massachusetts. I knew where Boston was. I knew where Worcester was. I had to look on the map to figure out where Springfield was. So have been here almost 4 years. And the Diocese of Springfield covers the 4 western counties of Massachusetts. So it's Hampden, Hampshire, Franklin, and Berkshire. A lot smaller area, you'll note, than Bishop Hazelwood has to cover. He is of the Synod of New England, so he has states instead of counties. But it's good to be here and great to have this group together this evening to explore our faith a little more and to thank God for the faith that has been implanted in our hearts. So thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you.
I too got it wasn't a phone call, but it was a call that I was not allowed to say no to. When 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, I was elected Bishop of the New England Synod, which, as Bishop Rozanski just said, is all of the states of New England plus 2 counties in upstate New York. So our synod, which is another word, same as diocese, same way to think about it, stretches from Stamford, Connecticut to Caribou, Maine. And people ask me, well, where is your office? And sometimes I say Worcester, but most of the time I say my car. So I spent a lot of time on the road. I'm a native New Englander, born in Concord, Massachusetts. My father was a civilian advisor to the military, so we moved around Florida, California, went to school in New York City, ended up back here in New England. I also thought I was going to be a parish pastor my entire ministry. And now I'm doing this in New England. To bring it back to the sports metaphor, I mean, we moved to New England in 1993, and I mean, we've got, I can't even count how many Super Bowls, an NBA championship, a cup, 2-3 World Series, Stanley Cup. I mean, this is the place to be. I'm pleased to be here and looking forward to this conversation. This is like the 3rd or 4th of these Lutheran Roman Catholic experiences that we've done in this year of commemorating the Reformation. And I got to say, this is the most unique setting.
Well, good. Thank you both, bishops, for being here. And I'm Pastor Nathaniel Anderson. I serve the Lutheran and Episcopal parishes in Wilbraham, just to the east of here. And a joy to be with these 2 wonderful leaders tonight. So we just took a little quiz, and did you guys take it? How'd you do?
I need to go to the principal's office.
You know, we did a Faith on Tap a couple of years ago on ecumenism, and we had a similar quiz with statements from many denominations, Methodist, UCC, Episcopal, Baptist, and I made it intentionally deceiving so that it seemed to be something else, right? And the point was that we hold so much in common, but that we tend to put the emphasis on some different particular things. You know, when you think about Lutherans and Catholics, and we're the dominant group, sometimes we don't get a whole lot of exposure to the other. I mean, if you're a Lutheran in Minnesota, everybody's, Lutheran, right? It seems. There's, several dioceses in Massachusetts. I went to a Roman Catholic high school, and I was the first Lutheran, even the first Protestant many of my friends had ever met. They were in parochial school for 8 years up to that point. So I'm curious about, what was your first experience meeting a Lutheran or a Catholic? And what comes to mind from that encounter? This isn't the first time, I don't.
Well, so I did not have a formal faith upbringing. I was baptized when I was 21 years old, and made my entry into the Christian faith through college campus ministry and camping. And so, to be quite honest with you, I didn't even walk into a church until my 20s. But I think what comes to mind when you ask that question, the first parish I served was in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and one of the very pleasant and experiences that I had there was my relationship with the Monsignor of the nearby parish. They also, our church had a small parochial school, and their parish had a rather significant size parochial school. And very early on, he invited me over to the rectory. We had dinner, and this was about 1986. It was kind of one of those classic, I thought I was in one of those movies from the 70s or the 80s. Where we were served this wonderful dinner, and he and I just developed this great relationship over time, and so that was my experience from the very beginning has always been positive. I've not been mired in the things that have divided us, and so that's kind of what comes to mind when you ask that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Sure. I grew up in East Baltimore, which at that time was a very heavily Polish neighborhood. And of course, everybody there was Polish and everybody there was Catholic. And there were 7 churches within walking distance of where I grew up. But we only went to our parish because the rest were either German or Irish. So we only went to our parish. So even amongst Catholics, it wasn't very ecumenical. And there was also in the neighborhood the first stirrings of ecumenical relationships, the Polish National Catholic Church, which had been the only schism from the Catholic Church that happened in the United States. And there was a group who had a church down the street from where I lived, and we were never allowed to go near there even. I mean, that's how separate things were. But fortunately, I had the joy of going to Catholic University as an undergrad, and then I stayed there for theology. And the whole world kind of opened up for me. I saw a whole new church and a whole different type of world than what I grew up in. And we were part of the theological consortium. So one of our teachers was a Lutheran minister who was grounded really well in the New Testament. And many of us Catholic seminarians took his course because the courses really did exchange because you were part of the consortium. So that was my first real experience of having a Lutheran teach scripture. And it was a very, very worthwhile course. He was a very engaging professor in teaching and very open to the questions of the students because he had not only Catholic and Lutheran students, but students of other denominations too who were there. So that was really my kind of first experience with ecumenicalism. And I enjoyed that class. And I said, when I went to Catholic University, I was like a dry sponge and just kind of took in everything. And I'm grateful to this day for the experience that I had there. Mm. So that was my first real encounter.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody in the back, can you hear us?
Yes.
You're good? All right.
Pastor, I'm concerned about the people sitting in the back there. Did they hear?
Oh, they're troublemakers back here. Yeah, we might have some, some more room maybe over here. Some people want to come in a little bit further. Or not. We're very intimidating, this crowd. So.
Next time we'll have the whole restaurant.
Well, of course we're doing this because we just recently observed the 500th anniversary of the start of the Protestant Reformation, and a lot has been made of that. And I think, interestingly, Lutherans have avoided the word celebration as we've talked about that. We talked about commemorating the Reformation. And I wonder, when you look back at perhaps past anniversaries of the Reformation or just sort of Lutheran Roman Catholic relations, what's changed in this 500th year? What's looking different in how we relate to one another?
Would you like me to start?
Yeah, why don't you go?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think the event that many of us know as Catholics that have affected our lives is Vatican II. And once we had Vatican II and were encouraged to have ecumenical and interfaith relations from the documents of that council, the United States was really the fertile ground for it. because this was the place that was the melting pot, where you had people from all different faiths and Christian and non-Christian faiths. So I think for us as Catholics, Vatican II was really the opening event for ecumenical and interfaith relations. And the Lutheran Catholic dialogue started very early on, right after Vatican II, and has continued for over 50 years. And we've had some great landmark documents that have come out from the dialogue, lots of different services and meetings that have brought us closer together. We're here with Dr. Karl Donfried, who I believe was part of the 1999 document on justification and the agreement between the Catholics and Lutherans on justification by faith. That was really a major leap in our ecumenical relations. And then more recently, just 2 years ago, there was a declaration on the way, and that was 32 points that spoke about church, ministry, and Eucharist, and the points on which over these 50 years Catholics and Lutherans have agreed. So that too was a landmark document, and I think has given us a lot of impetus for moving forward in our dialogue. So people say, gosh, after 50 years, you've two of these major documents. Well, there's been many other agreements that have taken place along the way, but I emphasize them as the two major ones within the past 20, 25 years. So that was a big, for me anyway, in looking back on it, that was a big step forward in our ecumenical, particularly with the Lutheran Catholic dialogue relationship.
Thank you.
And I think the only other thing that I would add is two things. One is we were very intentional about referring to the 500th anniversary as a commemoration as opposed to a celebration, because at least from the Lutheran side of the conversation, we wanted to be respectful of an event that in Roman Catholic history is not seen as positively as it is from a Lutheran perspective, to just put it mildly, but directly. And so therefore we wanted to, in the spirit of, moving forward, it was, we were commemorating an event that happened, as opposed to celebrating it. Now, most of our parishes, most of the parishes were like, October 31st, we're celebrating, but we wanted to commemorate. I think the only other thing I would add to your summary is that I think that Pope Francis has put some emphasis in this area. Last year, he was in Lund, Sweden, with the Lutheran World Federation, also honoring this occasion. And so it's pretty clear that Pope Francis values ecumenical relations. So I think that's another very, very recent thing that has happened that has given an extra kind of push and encouragement.
That's great. Thank you. Some of us are familiar with Christer Stendahl, a very prominent late Swedish Lutheran bishop and theologian. And when he talked about ecumenism and working together with other Christians and even other religions, he had this concept called holy envy, in which that we should have a willingness to recognize the elements of other traditions that we admire and wish perhaps that could be a part of our tradition. So I wonder, when you look at the Lutheran tradition, Bishop Rozanski, or the Catholic tradition, Bishop Hazelwood, of what do you have holy envy?
Two things come to mind. One is I think that your history and embrace of spirituality, of contemplative prayer, of those disciplines is something that candidly Lutherans, not only do we envy, we don't even know that we should envy, because Lutherans are a rather intellectually oriented in their structure of how they live their faith. That's not bad, but if it's all that it is, then it's rather limiting. And so I would say that's one. The second thing I would say is that I envy your orders. Because see, in the Roman Catholic Church, if you have a group of people that get together and they want to do something different, they don't have to split off and form a whole nother church or denomination or anything like that. They just start a new order, which is, it's brilliant, you know? Because if you look at the history of Lutherans, especially in America, it's a history of a division and merger, and we just kind of go back and forth and do that. So I would say your emphasis on spirituality and orders are the two things that come to mind when you ask that question.
That's great. Thank you, Bishop.
When I think of the Lutheran Church in my dealings with different Lutheran groups, one of the things that I envy is the knowledge of Scripture that I don't think Catholics quite have as part of our tradition. We tend more toward the devotional, but the knowledge of Scripture and in reading and watching different productions about Martin Luther, particularly in this past year of commemorating the Reformation, Martin Luther was the Mark Zuckerberg of his day. Really. He came at a time when the printing press was getting started, and Martin Luther had the genius to use the power of that printing press in the world and really brought the Scripture out to the regular people. And I envy the Protestant tradition, the Lutheran tradition, and many Protestant denominations' tradition of having such a grounding, a rootedness in the Scripture, and knowing the Scriptures, being able to quote them, that I don't think we as Catholics kind of had really until Vatican II, and still it's not ingrained in us as much as it is into those of the Lutheran faith.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you.
You know, if we were to get together, we'd really create something special.
There we go. Radical thought here. Wow. My goodness. Bishop Rozanski, you mentioned the Declaration on the Way, this sort of summation and further extrapolation on 50 years of dialogue between Lutherans and Catholics. And I was very struck by one of the suggestions at the end of that document was that we consider perhaps Eucharistic sharing before full visible unity, which is separate than how we've usually looked at it. We've said full visible unity must come first, then we can share Eucharist. But Declaration on the Way said, perhaps in the context of retreats or weddings or Lutheran Catholic marriage, that might be possible. And that's something I hear a lot from parishioners who are married to a Roman Catholic, this hunger to share Eucharist together. Do you think that's possible in the United States or even throughout the world?
Well, Pope Francis really answered that question in a way when he was, I believe, at Lund, and was questioned by a woman who was in a marriage between a Lutheran and a Roman Catholic. And he kind of left it, I think, deliberately, a little, part of it goes with conscience. And that's an important thing that I think Pope Francis respects. So an informed conscience. In the Declaration on the Way, when we look at those 32 points of agreement, we also, at the finish of that, said, these are some of the other areas on which we can work. So I was happy in the sense that we didn't just put out those 32 statements of agreement on ecclesiology and communion and ministry without saying, we've got some more work to do. And that's what was hopeful to me in the Declaration on the Way. So I will say that we do have some more work to do. And sadly, there are still divisions, but I think we've come a lot closer, and we've realized that we're not meant to be apart.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sounds good?
Sounds good.
Good stuff. We're in a German restaurant, so I need to try to pronounce something in German here. The Frankfurter Allgemeine, it's one of Germany's leading newspapers. Back when the Joint Declaration was signed in 1999, one of their editors wrote an editorial criticizing that agreement. And he said, "I may be an atheist, but I'm a Protestant." Now, there are, of course, important distinctions between our traditions, right? But to what extent do you see some of the obstacles being cultural rather than theological?
Oh. 80%.
We have enough time for all,
Yes. I mean, you mentioned, so we're in this German restaurant. I was just having a conversation with one of our pastors who grew up in southern Indiana, which was a historically large German population immigrating, and everybody was either Roman Catholic German or Lutheran German. So they could all come together in a place like this, which is kind of ironic that, a pub in Springfield is what brought us together. I think that cultural divisions are far more divisive, and maybe more so in these times, as a certain sense of tribalism has emerged in various democracies throughout the world, not the least of which we're seeing in our country. And I think that we run into problems not only in the faith community, but in the civic community when we define ourselves by our cultural approaches to problems. So, but I think, yes, ultimately the answer to your question is, yeah, it's cultural divisions that are maybe not far more significant, but they have more weight in the conversation.
Mm.
When we think back on the history, 500 years is a long time. And 500 years is a long time for attitudes and perceptions and misperceptions to become ingrained. And I think we're dealing with that as part of our history. And the Reformation has helped us, this commemoration of the Reformation has helped us to kind of look at those things and say, what are those cultural differences? What are those things that separate us that perhaps are extraneous to even our Christian beliefs? So it's been a good time to reflect on those things. But one of the things that I wish to emphasize is that we all know what rhetoric is like, particularly in our society when people are on two different points. And it's not a respectful dialogue. One of the main things that I think we can do as a service, not only to our churches, but also to our country and to our world, is to model what respectful dialogue is. Sure, there are differences. There's different cultures. So I think this is modeling what respectful dialogue is all about. That there's more that brings us closer together than what separates us. So this is a great opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Why has that become so difficult to have these sorts of exchanges?
Well, it's the attitude of I'm right and everybody else is wrong. Mm-hmm. And there's no openness to hearing what the other side has to say. Mm-hmm. Or I have to prove my point, and my point has to be better than yours. And there's not an ability to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. I even think our technology today has an effect on the way that we converse with one another, because it's disturbing to me that young people would more well converse using their thumbs than being face-to-face and talking to one another. Mm-hmm. So I think as faith communities, we can approach one another with the approach of dialogue and openness in talking with one another, and give a model to everybody else what it is to truly be respectful, but even in the points where we do disagree, that respect can still be there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A lot's been made with Declaration on the Way and some other documents where we talk about all these areas of commonality. We had that quiz, and pretty much all of those were both, right? I mean, we all hold the same document to the most degree. are we reaching a point where we agree enough on the substantive issues that there could be unity in diversity? That there could be, yes, we disagree on some things, we have different practices, but it's enough that we can come together. Or are there some issues that we still need to do some hard work on as Lutherans and Roman Catholics?
Well, I think there's a number. I think I look at this as, I'm going to use the analogy of dating. And I think that, when you first meet somebody, you don't ask them to get married on the first date. I mean, all right, a few people have, and that's another story. I don't want to go down that road. But you begin a process of getting to know one another. And as, Bishop Rozanski mentioned, Vatican II is a turning point that's 50 years old in a 500-year history. We're still courting. And so I always found that people that I was performing weddings for, if they cultivated that relationship well over time, it tended to have a positive impact on their marriage. And so I think that that's where we are right now. I think that the animosity has, for the most part, largely disappeared. Yes, on both sides there are a few, but you're always going to have that. But I think for the most part we're in this process of moving and getting reacquainted with one another. I mean, one of the great things for me in this year is I've now done events with bishops and archbishops throughout New England, and this commemoration has helped that happen. And so, I mean, that's a positive. And we'll have to meet again without all of these other people.
Anything to add?
Sure. I would see your putting that forth as you did as both and. It's not either or, it's both and. We know that there has been a lot of progress and a lot of agreement. We know that there's a ways to go. But we are moving, as Bishop Hazelwood said, in a really positive direction. And I think all of us, and particularly I really admire either ecumenical or interfaith couples who respect one another and one another's faiths, and who help each other to live out their faith and their commitment to their faith. That takes a lot of work in a marriage, and that takes a lot of compromise. And but it contributes to really just a very healthy relationship, even though it takes a lot of work. But I think we have so many examples in our interfaith or ecumenical couples who show us really the way to live that out. They're the pioneers.
Got a few of them here tonight, I think. So, yeah. Whenever I walk into a Roman Catholic church and I flip through the missalette, I'm always amazed at there's all these Lutheran hymns in there. I found "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God" in those little books. And on the flip side, I think a lot of Lutheran laity would be surprised at how much Roman Catholic tradition is in our seminaries, Catholic social teaching, Catholic doctrine. We seem to be borrowing, stealing, collaborating quite a bit already. And I think that's not always clear and aware to people. So is there a way we can celebrate all that sharing that's already taken place? And are there places where we could be collaborating more? And I mean, stealing's a bad word, but borrowing and utilizing each other's gifts?
Well, I think if it sounds like you're visiting Roman Catholic parishes and stealing their missalettes.
They're seasonal. They don't want them back.
I mean, there's in liturgy and worship that's happening. I mean, that's happening all in ways we don't even know about. It used to be that it had to have a certain kind of official. When remember the days when everything had to be in a book? I mean, now everything is on the internet. You can borrow liturgies from all kinds of traditions and from one another. So I think that's happening. That's probably happening more than we realize in an informal way. parish pastors and parish priests are probably looking. And, certainly I know, in our background, our training, we're reading Roman Catholic theologians and how they exegete passages from the Old and New Testament, and vice versa, as you mentioned with your seminary education. So I think it's going on, and will just continue even more and more.
That's right.
One of the great contributions as people of faith that we have is looking out for the common good. And I think that as we continue to work together and maybe borrow from each other's traditions in different ways, we can work together for the common good in our neighborhoods and in our area. We have the opioid addiction here in Massachusetts, but throughout the United States, that is a huge problem. And that's one of the ways in which people of all faiths, either ecumenically or interfaith, can work together. It's a way of lifting up those who are addicted to opioids to help to better their lives. We can work on that together. And that's a positive thing for our community. So I'm using that as one instance, but there's so many other ways in which we can have those goals on working for the common good as people of faith.
And what sort of things would you hope in your parishes, in your synod, in your diocese, what could individual parishes be doing this is a great evening tonight. We're all together. We're sharing dialogue and camaraderie. But what sort of little things could be done at the parish level? I often say it's one thing for a bunch of guys in clerical collars to go into a boardroom and hammer out an agreement, right? And then it gets put on a library shelf and maybe forgotten about. But like in the real down the grassroots, what sort of things might we do?
Well, I think people here could go back to their congregations, their parishes, and say, I'd like to hear, Father, or to the pastor, I'd like to hear more Roman Catholics quoted in your homilies. Or no. I wonder if, though, you just suggested a way in which we can find common ground, and that is around some of these deep issues that affect us. You mentioned the opioid crisis, certainly immigration as another one. I mean, there are a number of different ways in which people of faith can get together. Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Episcopalians, Methodists, Jewish brothers and sisters, the Islamic community. There's a number of different ways in which we can be much more intentional about trying to solve some of the problems that we face in Western Massachusetts as one particular location. I think when we come together around things, we have the strength of numbers, and we can all have our unique ways in which we want to address those particular circumstances, but to unite in that way is one possibility.
That's great.
A few years ago, I met with a group who are interfaith couples or ecumenical couples of Lutheran Roman Catholic or Methodist Roman Catholic, and I was deeply touched by their witness of what they said and how they supported one another in their faith. And I think if we have many of those situations in our congregations, in our parishes, and perhaps looking for ways to support couples who are married but of different faiths, because they can give a powerful witness to us, and they certainly show us the way of how it's done on a grassroots level. And that you can have ecumenical relations at 40,000 feet, but it really doesn't mean anything here until it's grassroots and on the ground. So I think that would be important for us just to be aware of that.
That's a great point.
Well said.
I'd love to open it up for some questions from the assembly, to use a liturgical word. But anything you wanted to add before we do that, bishops?
Let's see what's going to emerge from somebody there with a New England Patriots hat, I think. Oh, okay. Couldn't see it.
I wanted to donate a Holy Cross. Yeah. You had mentioned, marriage and kind of jokingly say, let's get together sometime, right? Okay, fair enough, right? You mentioned this thing, not you don't get asked for marriage at the first date, but eventually there is a marriage, right? If this thing comes to fruition. So I'm wondering what our quote-unquote marriage will look like. What's the end game look like, right? We know, at least from a Catholic perspective, say we have the example where we end up in use, right? We see how that works, right? To a pew-sitting Catholic, that makes sense to me. Sure, let's do this thing, right? But I'm wondering, what's the end game look like?
Well, I think the question was basically, what's the end game for Lutherans and Roman Catholics coming together? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Well, I would say ultimately it's in Jesus. And so I think, and that's a very important aspect to have, to think beyond a human institutional understanding of coming together that may or may not happen. I personally think it is unlikely in that kind of coming together on an institutional structure, certainly in my lifetime. But I think that ultimately we need to carry the vision that Jesus articulated in terms of his desire that we would all be one. In what form and shape that takes, I think is undefined at this particular point in time. But I think we're called to live into that. And I know that that may sound vague and broad, but I think that's probably okay, and we need to be comfortable living in that tension of what that's going to look like. That's how I think about it.
I think that those who might have grown up in the 40s and 50s and the pre-Vatican II church couldn't even imagine where we are today. So what we look like now probably is totally inconceivable to those who lived in the 40s and the 50s.
It's true.
So it was purposely named the Declaration on the Way because it acknowledges that we're moving toward unity. We're striving for unity. But we got to let the Holy Spirit lead us into that. It's been 500 years, so it's in God's time and not ours. It's in Kairos, not Chronos. Kairos is God's time, Chronos is ours. So I think that with great patience, but with perseverance, we can move together toward that unity.
Well said.
Thank you.
Other questions? In the back there?
The same point. Considering, that if we don't hang together, we're all going to hang separately. Won't the unifying force of necessity of Christianity lead us farther along faster than you might otherwise think? I can remember when I was a boy, and I am a kid grew up in the 40s and 50s. I was very friendly with a Protestant boy down the street, and we both had our catechisms at home. I can remember reading that catechism even back then. And there was 10 cents worth of difference between
It all really hinges on our relationships. I know the story here that was told to me early on when Holy Trinity Church up in Greenfield, am I saying the right town, Greenfield, caught fire. The rabbi and the pastor, the Catholic priest, would get together many times a week for coffee or discuss different events and all. So when the rabbi saw that the church was on fire, he was the one who ran in and got the Blessed Sacrament out from the tabernacle and rescued it from the fire. And that's because of the relationship that they had together. He knew the importance of what having the Eucharistic bread in the tabernacle meant, and he was willing to go into a church that was on fire and rescue it. So I think a lot of it does depend on how we build those relationships and how we understand one another to help move this forward along. So I really salute the pioneers in the ecumenical movement who they were in uncharted waters, and yet they stepped into them and they didn't give up. They didn't back out of the waters when the waters got a little rough. They stayed with it. And because of their foresight and vision, we can be where we are today and striving toward unity.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
There's another.
Oh, yes.
I confess to being somewhat schizophrenic. I'm a Lutheran pastor that got started up to go to seminary by the Franciscans. And in my retirement, the nearest place to go to do my daily devotions is the local Catholic parish. So I'm truly schizophrenic. From that perspective of retirement, I speak kind of both from the pew and from the pulpit. And it strikes me that the institutional church, in all of its expressions, is struggling with the tension between truth and relativism, which I think is Benedict's big issue. And it seems to me that that's the same thing that our people are struggling with. Your truth is your truth, and my truth is my truth, is relativism. But how do we then discuss the truth, and how do we then do so in a respectful way? And my question is, I'd like to hear a comment on whether you think my perspective is accurate, that that's the struggle between truth and relativism, and how do the churches address that in each of the traditions?
Well, it's really, to put it in other terms, a struggle between faith and secularism. And what it means to be a person of belief in a secular world. Archbishop Charles Chaput in Philadelphia wrote a book recently called Strangers in a Strange Land. And it really is about the struggle you speak about, of how do committed Christians live in a very secular society? And what does that look like for them? And what witness can they give to the world? And I believe it's the witness of Jesus Christ. Secularism ultimately has us looking inward. Jesus has us looking outward. And that's the big struggle. But when we look inward and only to self, ultimately we're going to be unhappy because we're not going to find fulfillment. And I think that's a big part of the opioid crisis. There's so much unhappiness and not enough fulfillment in life. But as different churches, congregations, and ultimately institutional churches, we have to have people look outward to Christ and look outward to one another. So I think that's a big part of the answer of our witness to the truth in the world.
Yeah, I like that faith secular as a different language to say something similar to what I think Bob is raising with the truth and relativism. I think there's a legitimate critique of my own denomination to be made of erring in the direction of cultural accommodation. Now, I can say that, and a lot of people can nod their heads, but then when you want to get into the particularities about you want to choose this topic or this topic or this topic, then all of a sudden we're going to start to see the push and pull. But I do think that that's a legitimate critique of the expression of Lutheranism in the United States. On the other hand, there's a book that came out this past year. I think it's called The Benedict Option, written by a theologian who I think is Greek Orthodox, but I'm not sure, who's basically the Benedictine option. It was the idea of retreating from the world. And he was making the case that maybe now is the time for Christians to retreat from culture. And because culture is so pervasively influencing us to the detriment of our faith, that the only way forward is something like a modern-day Benedictine monastery. And this has engaged a lot of people in a number of different ways. It's a fascinating conversation. I'm not sure that that's the answer either. And so I think we go back to this tension. It's really the Niebuhrian Christ culture thing that was written about 50 years ago. And just to add one more piece of it, I think the cultural piece that's so difficult for us in the church today is consumer capitalism. And please do not hear what I'm not saying. That is not a critique of capitalism overall. I think that we can get into that as a separate conversation, maybe another night. As it is a flawed economic system that for the time being seems to be working, although I think there's questions about who it's working for. When I say consumer capitalism, what I'm talking about is the world, the water that you and I all swim in. Many of you filled up your gas tanks today with petro fuel. And that, when you did that because you needed to get here. You also tied into a whole global economic system. You have mortgages, and we in the church live in this financial world that is so much a dominant part of our lives. It's impossible for us to get out of, and it's very difficult for us to be prophetic about. How can I be prophetic when my denomination is making a contribution to my retirement plan? And so it's very difficult. So that's just another third wheel to add to what you raised. I think it's just to recognize we are in this tension. It is more difficult to be a person of faith today if you are really choosing to try to live that out fully with all of these competing forces that are going on. So anyway, I've kind of rambled into a couple of different areas, but I think it's an important topic. Worthy of another night at the Student Prince.
Let's have a standing reservation.
Right.
So we hear more often. Yeah, question over here.
I'm a parishioner, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Parish down the street from here. I know Lutherans believe in the real presence, the Eucharist, although maybe not exactly as Catholics. Since we don't share the same understanding of the priesthood and the ability to pass on the priesthood in the same way, do you believe that other Protestant groups like Pentecostals and Baptists and Methodists also share in the real presence, even though they don't realize it? And if not, why not?
So there was kind of two questions woven in there. One was about Holy Communion. The other one was about priesthood. And I'm probably not the person to answer the priesthood question because I'm Lutheran and I don't have the full the theological understanding. So maybe you can help us out there. But the question on communion is, so Lutherans understand that Jesus is present in the bread and wine. We tend to differ on defining how. And so Martin Luther did not want to have a metaphysical conversation. He did not want to get into the specifics of how is Jesus present. And so he used language about, we believe that Jesus is present in, with, and under. And so it is, to try to figure out a concise way to say it, for Lutherans, Jesus Christ is present in the Eucharist, as opposed to defining how particularly Jesus is in the bread or is in the wine. Now, other Protestants have quite varied views. And so, you mentioned a few. In some cases, so that's actually a relatively close understanding of the Eucharist to Roman Catholics. I recognize it's not the same, but it's close in comparison to, say, others in the Protestant who view it as a memorial meal. It is simply a meal in which you are remembering an event from 2,000 years ago. And how each of those Methodist, more Calvinist kind of understandings, there's kind of a spectrum that goes. When you get into more of an evangelical, they tend to be influenced largely by Calvinism, so they're going to be having that more memorial kind of perspective of it. Pentecostals to me are fascinating because I think you could be a Lutheran Catholic Pentecostal. But I just think they haven't done the rigorous theological work to understand that, because I think in some Pentecostal churches that I've been in, I think that they could embrace a lot more of the theology that we embrace And that would be a welcome and fascinating conversation. Are there any Pentecostals here that could help us out with that? So,
No, I grew up Pentecostal.
okay, all right. So we can talk about that
My
maybe
father's a
afterwards.
pastor in the Assemblies of God.
All right, excellent. So that would be fascinating to kind of hear that piece.
I would say they would probably agree very much on the church structure, the Assemblies of God particularly, but I would say with communion, it was strictly symbolic.
Okay.
So I would just, it seems to me if in Lutheranism there would be a real presence of some sort, even though it's defined differently, would a Pentecostals who's celebrating their own kind of Holy Communion, even though they consider it symbolic, would you say they are enjoying or experiencing that Lutheran kind of real presence as well?
I would say they could be, but I don't want to get into the specifics of saying that they would be, if that helps.
Bishop, anything to add on Eucharist or Holy Orders? And
See, this is where ecumenical conversation would really be fascinating. Let's bring the Assembly of God into this and have there. Now we're going to really have fun.
As Catholics, we take the words of Jesus at the Last Supper literally. This is my body. This is my blood. Do this in memory of me. So, and even if we reflect back for the early Christians, the story of Emmaus, of the two disciples on the road, is really the story of the Mass. Jesus explains the scriptures to them as they go along the way. They persuade him to come in to sit down at table with them, and when he breaks the bread, it's the aha moment. They realize that it is Jesus and he is risen. So for Catholics, that presence, that real presence, is really the mandate of the words of Jesus for us. So that's why theologically we have so much centered around the Eucharist. And that's why the Eucharist is so important in the lives of Catholics as well as in the lives of Lutherans, because we're taking that mandate of Jesus seriously. As time went on through, I wouldn't say there was a Protestant Reformation, and I don't know if Bishop Hazelwood would agree with me on that. I think there was Protestant Reformations that happened along the way. So different views came in about the Eucharist and about the Word. And again, as I said with Martin Luther, the printing press was on its ascendancy as Martin Luther was proposing his different ideas. So there's a whole spectrum, as you said, Bishop Hazelwood, of understanding the Eucharist. And I don't know if other faiths would accept at this point what Catholics are, what Lutherans believe about the Eucharist and how central the Eucharist is to worship.
That's great.
But I agree that it's really many reformations along the way. And then Lutherans being just Lutherans, we have had various folks who have reformed us one again and again and again, and that continues today. Yep.
Sure.
You know, if the printing press hadn't come around, I wonder if we'd just be another order in the Roman Catholic Church. I like to think of Lutherans as the Jesuits of Protestantism. So.
Other questions for the bishops?
I'd like to get back to a little bit, first a couple comments or questions, or it has to do with sort of what's been taking so long for us to get together. We sort of commemorate or celebrate 500 years of division in some ways, but we celebrate also the coming together of what happened in Vatican II. And now I think the lay people are more involved. They're willing to change. I think the institutional church, in a lot of ways, is holding us back. And I think a lot of lay people want to be together and want to celebrate that and think about the institutional church. That I got married about 50 years ago to a Catholic girl, and the first thing that the Catholic Church did was to deny me communion. Her family could do it. We're bringing two families together, And I think there are a lot of things that can happen or like people want to see happen. So we are closer together and not think about, well, what's it going to be in the future? Well, we don't know. But the thing is, let's do it.
Well, I think it was the institutional church that really helped us to recognize that these divisions were really scandalous and that we have to work on these divisions. But as I said, I think it's all in kairos and not chronos, in God's time but not ours. It's been 500 years since the Reformation, and there are a lot of misperceptions and a lot of hurts that are still there as you're experiencing them in your life. So to overcome them takes a long time. But it's in God's time. At least we're moving along on it.
What happened also was that we had 5 boys, and they all were all the boys at St. Michael's Cathedral who were part of the joined the ecumenical kind of thing.
Oh, okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Anything, Dad?
No.
You're good. You're good.
I don't need to answer. We don't need to both answer every question.
Wait, one more question over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here because this meeting gives me a bit of hope that perhaps there may be a beginning of a healing in the Christian American body that occurred. My understanding of American history is not perfect. I know Polish history better than American, but what I read somewhere that about 100 years ago, when the public schools in the United States used the Bible, and then what happened was that there was a disagreement between a Catholic and a Protestant bishop, I think, the 2 bishops, that, the Catholics, the Bible that was used in the public schools was the Protestant version. I don't know, it was King James or something. King James. Now, the Catholic bishop felt that it was not quite fair. There were more and more Catholics coming in from Italy, Ireland, and so on. And they couldn't find a way to agree. So they went to court. And some of you may know the details better than I, because I read this quite a while ago. But the judge said, well, since you're not agreeing, there will be no Bible in the school. Now, today, there is a Bible, but it's not. And the Bible, in my personal opinion, is the origin of the species, which I, as a scientist, do not consider all that accurate. Many of the premises that is origin of the species that is based on have been discounted by, and the book would have been completely different if Darwin knew what we know today about chemistry, biochemistry, and astronomy, and so on. So I'm raising this for the reason, specific reason, that about a week ago I read in the paper the Catholic Church here in the diocese is having problems. You had apparently 4 high schools at one time. Now you have 1, and it's even difficult to have one or 2. Now we have this audience here, and what I want to suggest that perhaps this one high school, Catholic high school, perhaps it could be reinforced by combining maybe the Lutherans and some other Protestants would get together and have a Christian where it would be okay to have a Bible as well as the origin of the species. You know, and I think it is a wound in the Christian American body that needs healing, because there are too many young people that just do not somehow are divorced from the concept that the origin is not a big lottery. like the casino that we're going to do here, where you get the origin started with someone a lot bigger and wiser than we are. And it's not just, the schools, realistically, I don't think it would be quite a struggle now to introduce people, and the strange thing is that there are not that many people who completely lost all faith, and yet there would be a lot who would go to Supreme Court, probably and beyond, and so on. Bible in a public school. How can you even think of this? Yeah.
Well, you raise a lot of important points for. I think that might be the third session when we all get together. Thank you. And we do want to give people time for table conversation. So maybe you have any final comments, bishops, you'd like to share with everybody before we.
Sure. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for being here this evening, because this really indicates a commitment to where we are going as a Christian people in working together and in healing what had happened over 500 years ago. And it's important, as I said, that in the relationships, that's where the healing takes place at the grassroots level. So I thank you for your commitment to be here this evening. I thank Bishop Hazelwood for his commitment to being with us, to Reverend Nathaniel for moderating our session this evening, and to the student prince for hosting us in such a wonderful place and being able to discuss so many aspects of what ecumenicalism and our Catholic Lutheran Catholic dialogue is all about. So I know that, and it's been raised here, in our impatience, we want to see things move quickly. You know, we're an instantaneous society. We turn on the light switch and the light immediately comes on, and that's what we expect in everything. But we have to realize that in other matters, it doesn't quite work as quickly as that. But the important thing is we're not giving up. You know, we're not saying, oh, we've come this far and we're not going to go any further. The declaration on the way has different other points that we need to have further discussion on. So continue to pray for unity. Jesus willed it among us, and it indeed has to happen. But in God's time, led by the Spirit, it can happen. But in the meantime, we can do a lot together, and we can model a lot to a very, very broken system. So thank you.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much, and I think we should do this again. It's a step along the way, and we'll continue walking together.
Great.
Very good.
Thank you.